Good evening. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. Welcome to this evening's ICB webinar with Dr. Jessica Hekman, titled The Biology of Socialization. Jessica is a veterinary researcher who has investigated stress behaviour in hospitalised dogs. After graduating from the Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine, Jessica completed a year-long internship where she specialised in shelter medicine, and she also has a PhD in genetics. She's currently studying the genetics of behaviour in pet dogs through the Darwin's ARC project and the Working Dogs project. During this webinar, Jessica will be exploring the development of function of the brain during the sensitive period of the puppy's early life stage. The first part of tonight's webinar will be a presentation by Dr. Hekman, followed by some time at the end for questions. Please type any questions that you would like me to put to Jessica into the chat box, and I will read them out at the end of the presentation. We will try to work through as many questions as possible within the allocated time. It's a real pleasure to have you with us this evening, so I'll now hand over to Jessica.
Thank you. That was a fabulous introduction. So I have, of course, more things to say about myself, but I almost don't need to because you filled in the details so beautifully. I do want to warn everybody before we get started that I have a poorly trained husband coming home in a few minutes. When he does, my 3 dogs are going to become hysterical. So I tried to get him to come home before this started, but stuff happens. So I will probably hit mute and be throwing a kibble scatter, and that will calm the dogs down, and then I'll be back. But if at some point you suddenly hear a commotion and then I disappear, that's what's going on. All right. So yeah, as I said, I do want to give you all a little background on where I'm coming from before we get started. So after my first career as a computer programmer, I went back to school to become a veterinarian because I had discovered a deep curiosity, a need to know why some dogs turn out fearful and possibly aggressive, and others don't. Having a dog who has difficulty dealing with scary things or who thinks that something like meeting a friendly stranger is terrifying is really challenging and limiting. There's a lot we don't know about why some dogs have these problems. There it is. All right, I'll be right back. All right, super quick. Yeah, so there's a lot we don't know about why some dogs have these problems, and this is the stuff that I really want to study and teach about. So when I became a vet, I thought that I would want to be a behaviorist and help people fix their busted dogs and help those dogs learn to be less scared. But it turns out that I don't really want to help fix busted dogs. I want to learn why they break in the first place. So I don't practice medicine. I don't have a behavior practice. I am 100% of the time in research. It's really hard to study what goes on in the brains of dogs in a non-invasive way. Obviously, the easiest way to get at a brain is to cut the head open. No one likes to do that to dogs. Definitely, I don't like to do that to dogs. There are a lot of different alternate approaches to studying the brain. The 2 that I know a lot about are looking at stress hormones and looking at genetics. So I'll talk about both of those today. And I'll also talk a little about neurobiology. I am not a neurobiologist. I've done a lot of reading in the area, but I don't know all there is to know. So please be patient with me if I don't know the answer to some of your brain-specific questions. So part of my education has definitely been living with my shy dog, Jenny, who received little, if any, socialization as a puppy. She spent her first 10 months in the same place where she was born. I would bet she had never been off that farm before the day she was surrendered to a shelter. And as a result, when I got her, she was terrified of all strangers. She's doing a lot better now, and I'll talk a little bit about her too. This is a photograph of her here on this slide. She's looking at the stranger taking the picture, and she's licking her nose in anxiety. And by the way, the stranger was there to take photos of me and my other dog, and that other dog was getting lots of treats to play that game. So when Jenny saw that, she asked that she could try to play too. When we saw she was still nervous about it, we stopped. So I just didn't want anyone thinking that we made her do this photo session and sort of cavalierly didn't realize how anxious she was. She did ask to do it. So then this webinar is not about how to socialize a puppy. There are a lot of great resources already out there about that. Also, because I'm not a dog trainer, I'm not the best person to tell you how to do it. What I do want to talk about, what is different in a dog's brain and body during the socialization period compared to after it. So it's a biology talk, not a training talk. If any of you out there are breeders, I think this talk may be especially relevant because while it doesn't tell you how to socialize your puppies, it will go into why very early socialization is so important and what research tells us about different general approaches to it. So I'm trying to make this talk accessible to people with different amounts of biology background or science background. So I'm going to start out with a quick tour of what socialization is so that we're all on the same page. And I'll also give some very basic grounding on how the brain works and what the stress response is so that you can understand some of the stuff that I'll be talking about later on. So if the early bit is all review to you, just be patient because I will then move on to cover the juicy stuff on the characteristic Hekman geekiness. So that will be in two parts. First, how the brain wires itself during the socialization period. And second, how the stress response tunes itself during the socialization period. So now, conversely, if this later bit ends up being a bit over your head, again, be patient because I will end with some take-home messages that should pull it all together in a way that's useful to people who work with and love dogs. After that, you will all shower me with insightful questions, and I will do my best to answer them. So you'll hear both the terms sensitive period and critical period used about the canine socialization period. And note that both of these terms are actually more general ones. For example, they are used about the time during which a bird learns the specific song of his species. They're also used for the time during which a mammal develops binocular vision and therefore depth perception, in addition to other changes that happen during development. So both of these terms refer to a period during which an animal, generally at an early stage in development, gains a particular ability, bird song, binocular vision, ability to be comfortable around humans. If the period is a sensitive period, then if the animal doesn't manage to gain that ability during the period, it can still gain it later. It's just harder to do, and it might never get to be quite as good as it would have been. If it's a critical period, then if the animal doesn't manage to gain the ability during that period, it will never gain the ability. So for example, songbirds have a sensitive period for learning their song. If they are isolated from other birds during this period, they will never learn to sing properly for their species. Their song will sound different from that of other birds. If they are introduced to other birds of their species when they're older, after the end of the sensitive period, they can learn a song from them, but they will never be as good at singing it as birds who learn the song during their sensitive period for song learning. An example of a critical period would be the development of binocular vision. If an animal is prevented from seeing from one eye during that critical period, for example, by putting a patch over it, then that eye will never work, even if the patch is taken off after the closing of the critical period. So, sensitive period means it's just much easier to learn the ability during that time, and critical period means it's the only time that it's possible to learn the ability. So, dog socialization is the period when dogs learn about their environment, what's normal, what's abnormal, like the talking couch in this picture, and what to be scared of. Is it a critical period or a sensitive period? Personally, I would say a sensitive period because dogs can learn to adapt to new experiences after that period ends. It's just harder for them to do so. Other people call it a critical period. Behavior is complicated, so it may be that the socialization period doesn't fit perfectly into one box or the other. So this is the period when it is easiest for dogs to learn to like humans, other dogs, cats, horses, going to the mall, riding in the car. Not that they can't learn to accept new species or new locations afterwards, but young puppies are generally more accepting of completely new experiences than adult dogs. All animals need to tune their brains to respond appropriately to the environments that they find themselves in. A dog living on the street needs to be fearful, prepared for lots of dangers. A dog living in a home, on the other hand, needs to be able to relax, and being constantly prepared for danger is actually detrimental to his health. It is normal for animals to adjust to their environments early in life, and in fact, there's evidence that they start to do this as early as in the uterus. But as adults, you have to stop making these adjustments. You can't be reevaluating your world all the time. You have to make some assumptions. So the sensitive period of socialization eventually closes, and the puppy brain becomes the adult dog brain. In the 1950s and 60s, a team of scientists working in Bar Harbor, Maine in the US raised puppies in a laboratory and laid the groundwork for much of what we know about socialization. Their work was published in the classic book, Genetics and the Social Behavior of the Dog, which is well worth reading and not at all a slog to get through. They found that puppies exposed to humans for as little as 2 20-minute periods per week are able to accept humans later in life. They didn't go into details about how these minimally socialized puppies did. I'd guess they took some work to be decent pets. But puppies who are not exposed to humans at all before the age of about 12 to 14 weeks have extreme difficulty in learning to accept humans, if they ever do. So Scott and Fuller defined the primary period for socialization as beginning when the puppy leaves the nest for the first time at around age 4 weeks. The socialization period gradually tapers off after that. Today, we believe that it is important to fully socialize a puppy, to expose him to the types of people, different species, and different environments that we expect him to deal with before the age of 3 months. Although the most important part of that socialization period occurs before the age of 8 weeks. I mentioned before that one of the ways I like to use to learn about what's going on in a dog's brain is by looking at stress hormones. Looking at changes in these hormones is a major way that we study socialization in puppies. By the stress response, I mean when a dog experiences something terrifying, like the arrival of the UPS truck, levels of stress hormones increase in his body. That's the stress response. The stress response has an on switch, a part of the brain called the amygdala, which works with some of its friends to turn the stress response on, to trigger it. It has a volume control, basically how high the levels of the stress hormone rise. And it has an off switch, another part of the brain called the hippocampus, which checks how high the levels of the stress hormone have gotten and switches the response off when it decides they're high enough. So during the socialization period, the puppy's brain is setting up the rule book for the on switch, the off switch, and the volume setting. What will turn the stress response on? How loud will the volume setting be? How high will the hormone levels go? And how long will it take before the off switch kicks in? The stress response is closely related to fearfulness. So when a dog is frightened of something, he feels fear and his stress response turns on. It's hard to say which is cause and which is effect. They seem to be interconnected. So all these settings, the on and off switch and volume settings, are easy to change during the socialization period and hard to change after it. We want a dog who doesn't become afraid easily, who is confident. A dog who, when he does become afraid, is only mildly afraid. And a dog who recovers from his fear easily. That is a dog who will be a fun companion when you're out and about and who's a confident competitor in dog sports. These are all settings in his brain that are set during the socialization period. So this photo is of my shy dog, Jenny, on the 8th day that I had her. I believe that she had never left the farm where she was born before she was surrendered to a shelter at 10 months old. She was never properly socialized. You can see how scared she was when I first got her. She actually peed every time I touched her, which I did as little as possible. So now, 9 years later, she's doing great. Although sometimes during webinars, my audiences get to hear her very impressive alarm bark, as folks did at the beginning of this webinar. She even has human friends who aren't me. But it takes her a long time to warm up to strangers. And she doesn't generalize about people. You can introduce her to as many men as you want. The next one will still have to start from scratch with her. When I got her, she had a hyperactive on switch. Everything scared her. She had a volume control set to high. She reacted strongly to everything, even things that most dogs don't think are a big deal. And she had a sticky off switch. When she was alarmed by something, she would stay alarmed for a long time. Some of this may have been true, even if she'd had good socialization. But for sure, it's much worse than it would have been because her socialization was woefully inadequate. But note that if she had stayed on her farm, she might have done fine. In fact, her first mom was surprised to discover how shy Jenny and her brother were when they were taken to the shelter. Jenny was well adapted to the farm environment. It wasn't a problem until she encountered new things. So what tells a dog to flip on the on switch when to find something scary? A dog associates some stimuli with feeling good and some with feeling scared. And a lot of these associations are made during the socialization period. Hopefully during this time, the puppy is mostly associating normal things like the UPS truck and you and other dogs with pleasant feelings, learning not to be scared of them. So things with good associations won't trigger the stress response. Things with bad associations will, of course, and things with no associations, totally new experiences, may trigger it as well. So we want the puppy to make as many good associations as possible. This is all about the on switch. Good associations with the UPS truck. I just realized I keep saying UPS truck and I'm talking to an international audience. But you guys have UPS, they're international, so I'm sure you know what UPS means. But I'll start saying delivery truck. How about that? Good associations with the delivery truck mean seeing it won't trigger a stress response. Bad associations with it mean it will. So the more that the dog's life is full of good associations at this age, the more he will generalize that life is easy and not scary. And the harder it will be to turn on his on switch, which is what most of us want in a pet. Now, particularly, this is a time period during which the puppy is better than an adult dog at generalizing. He meets a few women and he's able to generalize that women aren't scary. A few people in hats, he learns people in hats aren't scary, as opposed to adult dogs who are more likely to go for the specifics rather than generalizing. They'll think, this particular man in a hat seems to be okay, but that next one I'm not so sure about. Jenny, of course, didn't have a chance as a puppy to make good associations with things like trucks that bring strange men to our door with boxes, or with visits from my husband's parents. So those things terrify her now. So the socialization period is about setting up lots of hopefully good associations, generalizing them, to learn what things in the dog's environment should trigger the stress response and what things should not. So in other words, setting the rules for what turns on the on switch. Now, inevitably, the adult dog will encounter something new and or scary every so often. And so the question is, how will he respond to that? With terror or with cautious curiosity? During the socialization period, the stress response is tuned to be appropriate for the environment. Is the dog living outdoors with lots of dangers? Then it's good to have a strong stress response. Is he living as a pet with hardly any danger? Then it's good to have a mild stress response. So here I'm making the analogy to a volume control. If the volume setting is high, then the dog has greater levels of stress hormones in his body, and he also reacts more strongly. He feels more fear, and he probably displays more unwanted behaviors, like hiding and shivering, as Jenny did at first, or lunging and barking, as she graduated to eventually. After years of work, I have Jenny more and more able to deal with scary things more appropriately, for example, by retreating to a safe place, but it's been slow going to get there. It would have been so much easier for both her and me if she had just perceived normal things as normal right from the start. Some dogs encounter something scary and have real trouble recovering. Jenny used to be like that when I first got her. So I would drop a pan in the kitchen by mistake, and then I wouldn't see her for the next hour. Her stress response had trouble turning off, a sticky off switch that just liked to be in the on position. As she has been improving, her recovery time has shortened dramatically. So now I drop a pan in the kitchen and she alerts to it, but she sticks around to see if I'm still chopping vegetables and offering pieces to dogs. And now if I kick over a baby gate by mistake while we're training, she'll want to keep working, which is amazing. So again, this is a setting that the socialization period probably has a lot of influence over, and it's been slow to change this setting in her as an adult. So then, we want to set the puppy's parameters during his socialization period. We want his stress response to stay switched off most of the time. When it does get switched on, we want its volume control to stay low and for it to turn off again promptly. So the question then that I'm really curious about is, why can't we change these settings easily in adult dogs? What is actually different in the brain in adult dogs compared to puppies under 3 months of age? Because if we understood that, we might have some ideas about how to help dogs like Jenny, who got misprogrammed or inappropriately programmed early on. And we might have ideas about how better to breed dogs to have a genetic predisposition to have all these beneficial traits. So we don't have the whole story here. There's lots we don't know. But we do know some things about the brain and the stress response during the sensitive period of socialization. So I'll share those with you. All right, so that was the background. Now we're going to get into the stuff which is hopefully new for most of you. First, I want to focus on the brain and how it makes associations during sensitive and critical periods. I'll get back to the stress response itself later. Right now, we're just focusing on the on switch. How does the animal decide what's scary and what's not? Because a scary thing flips the stress response on switch on. That's all about brain wiring. This is a picture of the brain, which shows many of the pathways that information travels in. Basically, the way the brain works is by different parts of it passing information around, processing it a bit, and then passing it on for more processing elsewhere. So how the information moves around the brain is incredibly important to how the brain works. And it's something that's very hard to study and that we don't know as much about as we would like. This picture gives you some idea of the complexity of what's going on, but it is actually much more complicated than this, with millions of connections going different ways and making different networks. So it's really hard to study sensitive periods in socialization because we don't understand exactly which pathways in the brain, which networks are involved. We have some ideas, but not at the level of doing experiments to see things like, if this animal isn't socialized, then how does this network here change? But it's much easier to study the critical period in vision. In 1963, a pair of scientists named Hubel and Wiesel, possibly Wiesel, published a groundbreaking study in which they demonstrated a critical period for the development of binocular vision in kittens. Binocular, meaning the ability of both eyes to take in information and the ability of the brain to process that information into depth perception. So basically, these two researchers sewed one eye shut in some very young kittens so that the eye took in no light, no information. And they removed the sutures several weeks later. If they let the eye open after the end of the critical period, then that kitten never developed binocular vision. The eyeball itself worked fine, but the brain had not learned to accept and process the input from that eye. It didn't form the relevant wiring properly, and it was never able to do it later, critical period. The kitten would always be blind in that eye. The critical period had closed. The ability to process input from that eye and pass it to the right places in the brain was never going to be acquired. This is the kind of study that we do not do in kittens anymore, by the way, but we do similar things in laboratory rodents today. Because we know exactly what areas of the brain process vision, scientists are able to do these studies of deprivation of sight and then look at those parts of the brain to see how they develop differently from the parts associated with the eye that was not sewn shut. So my analogy here is from the part of the kitten's brain that processes vision to the part of the dog's brain that decides whether or not to trigger the stress response. As I said before, that's the amygdala and some of its friends. If the dog isn't exposed to a particular stimulus, like people in funny hats, during the sensitive period of socialization, then once that period closes, it is much harder for that part of the brain to learn to process that input appropriately. It will always be considered new and therefore potentially scary, as in my dog Jenny, who has such trouble meeting new people. So just like the kittens with one closed eye who fail to develop binocular vision, dogs who aren't socialized thoroughly can have trouble developing positive associations with new things. And this has to do with the connections in their brains. So what is actually happening in the brain during these critical and sensitive periods? What is different in the brain to let it learn about inputs from one or the other eye, or about men in funny hats, as the case may be? All right, super quick overview of neurobiology to get you the basics of what you need to know to understand this question. The brain is composed of cells, just like the rest of the body, but the cells in the brain have information processing capability, which is different from most of the rest of the body's cells. The important types of cells for information processing are called neurons. Those are cells that we classically think of as brain cells. There are also helper cells, which we're coming to learn more and more really participate in information processing much more than we once thought. This is a picture of a neuron. Notice how it is perfectly designed to network with other cells. It has branches on the left side for it to listen for input from other neurons, and then it has a long tail leading over to the right for it to send information to other neurons. Now, one neuron does nothing interesting on its own, Things become interesting when you string multiple neurons together in a row to pass around and process it, to pass information around and process it. The connection between two neurons is called a synapse. And this picture shows two neurons and a little spot where they attach together. That's the synapse. There's a small box around the connection to show where it is. So you see the neuron body on the left, you can follow its tail going over to the right, to the second neuron body on the right, and you see there it says synapse, and it points to that little box. So that spot where the two neurons connect, that's the synapse. In real life, there would be a bunch of helper cells in here too, assisting, but this picture doesn't show that. It would be hard to see what we needed to see with all those other cells clustered around. Also in real life, a single neuron would receive connections from many, many other neurons, not just one. So when you or a dog learns something, the process that's going on in the brain is a synapse getting stronger. The connection between two neurons is getting stronger, they're communicating better. When you unlearn something during the process of extinction, the synapse is getting weaker. Of course, in real life, anything you learn involves changes in many, many synapses, not just one. But basically, this is what's going on, connections between neurons changing strength. So during a sensitive or critical period, how is learning different? As this period begins, the baby brain is making lots of new synapses. Everybody's talking to everybody. Connections are everywhere. The neurons in the baby brain are reaching out their arms in all directions and connecting with everyone that they can. So that's chaos, to have everyone trying to connect to everyone else. So what happens as the sensitive or critical period progresses is that synapses that are used are kept. So two neurons that actually talk to each other get to keep their connection, their synapse. Synapses that aren't used are removed. So if two neurons end up never sending information to each other, those synapses get removed through a process called pruning. This is the use it or lose it philosophy of brain development. It's not that whole neurons die, it's that specific connections are lost. One neuron might be connected to thousands of other neurons, and then it might lose some of those connections and only be connected to a few hundred. Those helper cells in the brain that I mentioned are actually eating the connections, just like you might trim a branch. They don't eat whole neurons, just the extra unused connections to other neurons. So this process has been pretty well detailed in the development of binocular vision. As I said, we've moved on from kittens to laboratory rodents. We believe the same process is going on in the parts of the brain involved in the stress response during puppy socialization. But as I said, that's a lot harder to study. As I mentioned before, there are two brain regions that are particularly important for triggering the stress response and shutting off the stress response. This corresponds to animals getting afraid of lots of things or not a lot of things, and animals having a slow recovery from fear or a fast recovery from fear. The amygdala, which is that little red portion highlighted in the brain on the left, is a region involved in turning on the stress response. The hippocampus, which is the red region highlighted in the brain on the right, is a region involved in turning off the stress response. So knowing these two brain region names can help you connect to popular science stories that you might see on the internet to what is going on in your dog's brain, because these two parts of the brain are well studied and frequently reported on. The number of synapses in the brain regions have been studied in a lot of situations, including rats living in very enriched environments, where they have lots of places to hide, lots of things to do, and rats living in very unenriched or barren environments. The synapses in the brain regions haven't been specifically studied during socialization, however, not so far as I can tell. I suspect this is because rat socialization is not as clear-cut a thing as dog socialization. If a dog isn't socialized to people, it's a big deal and pretty obvious, but we don't have the same way of measuring whether a rat learns to be comfortable around humans or not. And of course, we don't want to take unsocialized dogs and cut their heads open to look at their brains, which would be the other way of doing it. So for now, we don't know for sure. But when you're helping a puppy make good associations during his socialization period, what you are really helping him do is to prune his synapses in a way that is appropriate for the world he's going to live in. This may be why it's so much easier for young dogs to generalize associations than adult dogs. Because young dogs are still in the middle of pruning synapses, and they can build synapses for associations more easily than adult dogs do. We don't really know that this is why they generalize more easily, but it's a possibility. So now that we've covered the socialization, how the socialization period affects whether the stress response is triggered, we can move on to the question of how strong the stress response will be when it's triggered. Will the volume be turned up to 11 almost every time the animal is startled? Or will it only go high in really exceptional situations and mostly be low, resulting in an animal who doesn't overreact to small things? Earlier, I mentioned a stress hormone. I was referring to cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that sends the message around your body that something challenging is happening, something scary like a thunderstorm, or something uncomfortable like being too cold or being hungry. It tells your body to focus on dealing with the present situation, running away, finding a place to warm up, hunting food, and to put off the things that are less immediately important, sleeping, digesting food currently in your stomach, finding a mate. So a rise in cortisol levels doesn't have to be triggered by something fear-inducing. In fact, when playing or exercising hard, a dog's cortisol levels are almost certainly going to rise. So some elevation of cortisol levels is good. But if it goes up too high or stays up too long, that's bad. And we'd rather it didn't go up all that high for things that aren't really a big deal, like thunderstorms or the delivery man or visiting Grandpa Bob. So when the amygdala triggers, I moved that slide too soon. So when the amygdala triggers the hormonal stress response, the end result is that cortisol levels rise in the body. If the stress response is strong, that means that cortisol levels rise higher. If the stress response is more mild, cortisol levels won't rise as high. A strong stress response may be due to something truly stressful, like someone breaking into the house in the middle of the night and threatening the people you love. That's appropriate. But some dogs have very strong stress responses to things that aren't actually going to hurt them, like thunderstorms or delivery man or Grandpa Bob. And that's a problem. Their stress responses are just tuned high all the time. It's hard for them to have a mild response, even when the mild response would be appropriate. These are the dogs who we think of as fearful and reactive. So how are these differences in stress response reactivity set up during the socialization period? What controls how they develop? Genetics or the socialization process itself, for good or for bad? So the first studies on how the stress response differs in very young animals were done, unsurprisingly, on rats. In rats under 2 weeks of age, their stress hormone doesn't rise in response to scary stimuli, and they don't show a fear response to scary things either. In fact, some really interesting studies show that if the rat's stress hormone levels are prevented from rising as they mature, they will also be prevented from developing a fear response. And when these animals were then injected with the stress hormone, their fear response appeared. So in other words, we discovered in young rats that the first onset of the fear response and the first onset of the hormonal stress response happen at the same time. And the two responses are very closely related in some way that we don't yet completely understand. This period, before the first onset of fear and the first onset of the stress response in laboratory rodents, is called the stress hypo-responsive period, meaning that the stress response is very small during this time, hypo-responsive. So this answers our question about how the stress response is different during the socialization period, at least during the earliest parts of the socialization period. It's just not there, at least for the first part. And yes, this actually has been demonstrated in dogs. A really cool 2015 study looked at how puppies react to new stimuli. They used a moving and quacking toy duck. Just as in rats, this study showed that puppies who don't exhibit fearful behavior in response to things like the terrifying duck also don't have a cortisol response to the duck, and that the fear behavior appears between 5 and 7 weeks of age in dogs. So by 4 weeks, a puppy is venturing out of the nest and beginning to make good and bad associations in the world around him. And notice that he's doing so for his first few weeks without having any fear response, which means that he is primed to make good associations more easily than bad associations. Things that he encounters during these few weeks are things that he is likely to learn are not scary, because he first learned about them at a time when it was really hard for him to be afraid. Then, somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks of age, his fear response kicks in, and he starts making bad associations more easily than he had been. So there's a big change then between 5 and 7 weeks. Before that, it's extra easy to socialize a puppy. Around 7 weeks, it starts getting gradually harder. The advice we give new owners of puppies is to work hard on socialization up through 12 to 16 weeks of age, and that the socialization window really is closed by 16 weeks. And that's true. You can still make a big difference in a dog's adult personality during that time. Look at Jenny's changes. But you can make an even bigger difference earlier, from 4 to around 5 to 7 weeks. Well, the dog is still at the breeder's. And this is why it is so important, if you're getting a puppy from a breeder, to make sure that the breeder has done a lot of socialization work with that puppy. Because you can do a lot too from 8 weeks on, and you should. But what the breeder does lays some incredibly important groundwork. So what was particularly interesting about this 2015 puppy socialization study was that they looked at 3 different breeds of dog: German Shepherds, Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, and Yorkshire Terriers. And they found that this fearful behavior in response to a novel stimulus, the moving duck toy, turned on at different ages in different breeds. The German Shepherds displayed fear behavior earliest at around 5 weeks of age, and the Cavaliers displayed it the latest at around 7 weeks of age. The Yorkies were intermediate. So the Cavaliers potentially had 2 more weeks compared to the German Shepherds to interact with their environment before their fear response turned on, which could be huge. And it's really interesting that the Cavaliers are bred to be pets, for which a mild stress response would be a good thing, while the breed standard for German Shepherds states that they are not inclined to make immediate friendships with strangers. So this relationship of development to breed suggests that there is a genetic component to how the stress response develops, that genetics may control the timing of when the stress response starts to mature. And that causes the socialization period to potentially close earlier or later in some animals than in others. In the lab where I did my PhD, Kukekova Lab at the University of Illinois, we studied the genetics of 2 groups of foxes. One group of foxes was bred to be tame, and the other group of foxes was bred to be fearful and aggressive. And these foxes had been selected in Russia for these behaviors for more than 50 years. And it turns out that the tame foxes show this onset of cortisol response and fear behavior several weeks later in life than the aggressive foxes do. This also suggests a strong genetic influence on the timing of this onset of fear. We also know that the tame foxes have a much milder stress response as adults than the aggressive foxes do. Their cortisol levels don't go up as high. So we wonder if this has to do, at least in part, with this early timing of their stress hyporesponsive period, their early socialization period. So, of course, the big question then is, what is changing in the brain when the cortisol response starts up and fear turns on? Because if we understood that, maybe we could figure out how to delay it in some cases. Of course, the answer is we don't really know for sure, but we believe it may have to do with the off switch. It seems that animals in the stress hyporesponsive period have really good off switches. Basically, the way the stress hormones are carried in their blood is different in animals in this period, so that their hippocampus is tricked into thinking there's more cortisol out there than there actually is. So as soon as the stress response turns on, the hippocampus goes, "Whoa, that's a lot of cortisol," and immediately flips the stress response off again. So that's one hypothesis, the only one I have yet found, for why the stress response is basically non-existent during this period. The brain is hyperactively turning off the off switch because it's confused about how much stress hormone is out there. So it's all very well to point at tame and aggressive foxes and Cavaliers and German Shepherds and say that this timing of the onset of fear when they are babies has something to do with the differences in their personalities when they are adults. But we don't know that for sure. It could just be a coincidence. The timing of this onset of fear could have nothing to do with their adult personalities. It could be something else in the breed differences or in how those foxes were selected. I do think it's going to be something super important to follow up on. All right, so that's genetics. Yes, it does seem very likely that genetics has something to do with how the stress response develops differently in different animals. And one possible way that it does this is by genetically controlling when the fear response turns on, which suggests that getting a puppy from parents with solid personalities is important. You already knew that, but this gives you some information about exactly what is inherited from these solid parents. But what about environment? What do we know about all the socialization that you actually do? How does that affect the development of the stress response? A now classic study in rats tells us that how the mom takes care of her babies can affect their personalities when they grow up. Studies from a Canadian scientist named Meany in the 90s and early 2000s showed that some rat moms are very attentive, doing lots of licking and grooming of their pups. Others not so much. The pups raised by attentive moms grew up to be more resilient to stress, less fearful. And interestingly, this was also because they had really good off switches. The off switch seems to be quite a big deal in regulating the stress response. This was definitely due to the mom's care and not to genetics, because it happened even when a mom raised pups who weren't genetically related to her. Meany did cross-fostering studies specifically to make sure of that. So it turns out that the actual mechanism for making a hyperactive off switch in these rats is pretty similar to the one I just described. In this case, the little receptors in the hippocampus, the little sensors that tell how much stress hormone is floating around in the blood, the more confident rats had more sensors. They're called glucocorticoid receptors. So that these confident rats were really good at flipping their off switches as soon as they saw any stress hormone. Having more sensors meant a faster, stronger signal to tell the off switch to flip. The fearful rats had fewer stress hormone sensors, so that let their stress hormones get higher before their hippocampus realized that it was time to flip the off switch. In humans, we similarly find fewer of these sensors, glucocorticoid receptors, in the hippocampus of people who suffered from childhood abuse than those who didn't. We believe that this mechanism is similar across all species of mammals, and that there's no reason to believe that dogs are different from humans and rats. And again, what's interesting about this is that it's not genetic. It has to do with environmental influences, maternal care. So maternal care is interesting, but what we really care about is what is easiest for us to affect. In other words, how we interact with the puppies, how we socialize them. So is there any evidence for how that works? In the case of the rats, some work was done in which rat pups were briefly taken away from their moms and then returned repeatedly. This is sort of like socialization, letting them experience the world in small, manageable amounts when very young. And in fact, the rat pups who had been handled at an early age did grow up to be less fearful. But it turns out that when they were returned to their moms, the moms responded by licking and grooming them an extra amount. So it's possible that the mom's response is why these brief separations were so beneficial to the pups, not the separation itself. So what about in dogs? A 2017 paper by Emily Bray, a researcher at the University of Arizona, looked at maternal care and how it relates to success in becoming a seeing eye dog. Bray studied dogs who were purpose-bred to work at this job, who raised their litters in guide dog kennels. She recorded the maternal care from the guide dog moms and compared the maternal care that puppies received with how well the puppies did when they grew up and entered the program to become guide dogs. Guide dog training, as you probably know, is incredibly challenging, and only about half the puppies who enter a program succeed at it, even the ones who are purpose-bred for the job. Bray found that, somewhat surprisingly, some moms who were less attentive than others raised puppies who were better suited to being seeing eye dogs. So that's backwards from what we saw in the rats, right? So it's a surprising finding, and it's important to think carefully about the differences between the guide dog study and the rat studies. In the rat studies, moms were compared along a whole spectrum of maternal care, from very attentive to very inattentive. With the guide dogs, the moms were all quite attentive. It's possible that if some inattentive moms had been included in Bray's study, they would have raised puppies who didn't do well as guide dogs, as we would have expected from the rat studies. But it appears that there just aren't moms like that in the guide dog population, which has been selected for so many generations, for so many things, seems to have included selecting from nurturing mothers. So in fact, it may be that it's possible for a mom to be overly attentive, and that this is what Bray was seeing, that a lot of attention is good, as we saw in the rats, but it's still possible to have too much. Specifically, Bray saw that moms who made it a little harder for their puppies to nurse, who lay in positions to make getting at the nipples more challenging, were more likely to raise successful puppies. So, is it possible that in fact, a little challenge early in life is a good thing? So yes, there is a hypothesis that mild, not too much stress in very early life can be a good thing for raising confident puppies. This work was done by the US Department of Defense in the 60s to 70s to see if exposing very young puppies under 2 weeks of age to small amounts of stress would make them grow up to be more confident adults. This was called the Biosensor or Superdog program, and the DoD reported that it resulted in dogs who were very tolerant of stress. But they did not publish their methods or detailed results, so it's hard to know exactly what they did and how they tested their results, and therefore whether or not to believe their results. Some information about the protocol has been published, and I know many breeders do use this method with their puppies. It's now called early neural stimulation. The idea is that the puppy is basically annoyed periodically when he is very young, so that he learns to tolerate mild stressors as a normal part of life. Now I have here a picture from a paper discussing this method of a very young puppy having his toes tickled. So does this result in having the volume on the stress response turn down? And is this why these dogs that the military raised were so tolerant of stress? It seems possible, but again, there's just not enough information to know for sure. A lot of breeders do use this method though, and I think it's a good idea to try it. Now, we do know from human studies that trauma in childhood is a bad thing. It can have long-term effects on personality and definitely on the stress response. And again, this has to do with the off switch for the stress response in the brain. The same mechanism actually, as has been so well documented in rats with very attentive or inattentive moms. As I said previously, children who undergo childhood trauma often have a really sticky off switch, just like the rats who had inattentive moms, resulting in a stress response that is hard to shut off and therefore difficulty recovering from stress. Which makes sense, right? If your brain learns early on that there's going to be trauma in your life, then you want to be prepared to deal with that. So some children are able to deal with childhood trauma and not end up with an unusually loud stress response, while others are less resilient and carry the effects of their childhood trauma as an overreactive stress response for the rest of their lives. They're unable to adapt when later life proves that that trauma was unusual. There is research looking into why some children are resilient and others are not, and genetic influences have been found. So here again, we see both genetics and environment having an effect. This is called a gene by environment interaction. If you have a genetic risk factor and you have a trauma, you'll end up much worse off than if you have only one of those two things. And while we haven't demonstrated this in dogs, it is pretty definitely going to be the same there. Genes interacting with environment and experience to form a personality. So I promised you take-home messages, specific advice, and so here it is. Remember that the very early part of the socialization period is important. It's valuable to start socializing the puppy as soon as he leaves the nest, usually at around 4 weeks. Now, this doesn't mean that you won't find some very nice puppies in shelters who missed out on that early socialization. As I've said, genetics can help cushion puppies, even if the environment isn't perfect. And late socialization can still be somewhat effective, just slower. But if you are caring for a litter yourself, you should do your best for them by making sure their socialization starts promptly. You're going to get a huge bang for your buck by socializing during those 1 to 3 weeks when the puppy is out of the nest, but his fear response has not kicked in yet. But just because you get your biggest bang for the buck early on does not mean you should stop there. Keep socializing after that. The effectiveness of socialization will taper off, but getting everything you can out of that period is important. Early, mild stress is probably good and helpful for developing a stress response with the volume turned low. Proper socialization will include mild stressors, meeting new people, getting your paws touched and your mouth handled. This sort of mild stressor is great for a puppy in the socialization period, particularly when in the presence of a trusted individual like the dam or the owner. Overdoing these experiences so that they become aversive, however, will do damage, certainly by creating bad associations, but possibly also by helping tune the puppy's stress response higher. Remember that genetics does seem to play into how the stress response develops. We saw this in the studies with the tame foxes and with the dog breeds that had different schedules for the onset of fear and activation of the stress response. So genetics matters, and it's important to breed dogs who are calm and confident, and to not breed dogs who are fearful. I think we, as members of the dog community, can do better at encouraging breeders to focus on breeding behaviorally robust animals and at not breeding behaviorally challenged animals, even if they are fantastic in the breed winning. Because these dogs aren't just show dogs, they are pets first and foremost. Moreover, breeders can do better at focusing on breeding moms who are good moms. If a dog turns out to be a bad and inattentive mom, it may not be a good idea to keep breeding her. This is environment, not genetics, but unless you're planning to foster those puppies out to a better mom, it's something to take into account when making breeding decisions, because it's important and will affect them as they grow up. It's not too hard to find breeders who have good answers to these questions that I list here. I don't think that early neural socialization is essential, but I think it is a mark of a breeder who is giving it their all. I like that the puppies are getting interaction so young as well. We don't know enough about maternal care to have solid questions here, but if the breeder says something like the mom doesn't like the puppies, she wanted to get away from them as soon as possible, or I had to help out, I would treat that litter with caution. And it's obviously a complex question of what puppy to get, so none of these have black and white answers. But ask the questions and put them in the hopper with the other questions you're asking about health and behavior and pedigree of the parents. Now, I have a shelter background, and I feel strongly about getting dogs from shelters. All but one of my dogs have come from shelters or rescue groups. That said, it's not the best way to raise a puppy. Foster care is best. A foster who knows what they're doing is even better. If you're looking to raise a really solid pet dog, then I hesitate to get a shelter puppy. Get a shelter adult where you have some idea of how they turned out. Or get a puppy who you know was born in an experienced foster home and whose dam you get to meet, although these are really hard to come by. Here in New England, where I live, puppies are mostly shipped up from regions with more dog overpopulation problems. Or get a shelter puppy and know that you're rolling the dice. And you're always rolling the dice when you get a dog, but your dice are more weighted the way you don't want if you get a puppy whose parents you don't know and who probably had a pretty crappy early environment. So in short, genetics is important in getting a dog who responds well to her environment. And environment, in other words, a good socialization program, is also important. You want both if you want to get a really resilient dog. But it is also a hard truth that there are no guarantees in life. I got a puppy from a good breeder who did a great job socializing him, but he injured himself when he was 5 months old, and it was a hard injury to get diagnosed. So he spent 1.5 years of his early life in pain before I got him fixed. So he grew up to be mildly anxious and mildly dog aggressive. He doesn't want strange dogs getting too close, especially boisterous ones like Labradors. He really hates Labradors. On the other hand, I had a friend who adopted a puppy who had been the runt of her litter. It was an oops litter, unplanned. The puppy's mom attacked her, so puppy had terrible maternal care. Puppy was raised in a horse stall for those incredibly important first few weeks. Mom got at her again, and the puppy spent time in a ICU. When my friend got the puppy at 12 weeks, she looked underdeveloped because she'd had such a hard start. She looked less than 8 weeks old to me. I warned my friend that this was a bad idea. She kept the puppy anyways. And I'll tell you, that puppy grew up to be a rock star. She was outgoing, friendly to everyone, even strange dogs, and she was drop dead gorgeous, so you never do know. And as you've guessed from this talk, there is a lot that researchers haven't even looked at in terms of canine socialization. But some interesting new projects are starting to do this work, which makes me really hopeful that soon we'll know a lot more. So thank you so much for listening this evening. If you want to know more about me, you can go to my website, dogzombie.com, and from there you can get on my mailing list to find out when I'm giving more webinars. I also do consults, mostly for folks who want to talk about whether it's a good idea to breed their dog or want to talk through what we know about the dog's genetics or how to interpret a specific genetic test. I'm also starting a new initiative called the Functional Dog Collaborative, which is a place for people to talk about best practices for breeding dogs who are really resilient pets or really functional in other jobs, whether they be purebred or mixed breed. So you can find out more about that at functionalbreeding.org. All right, I hope you have some questions for me because that is my favorite part of webinars. And I'm going to try to turn my camera on now. Turn video on. Ooh, look at that. Hi.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Very, very interesting. Yeah, we have got some listener questions. And our first one is from Natasha. And she says, can I please have a reference for the study regarding the patch over the eye during the critical period?
Oh, yes, I will have to look that up, but I can certainly find it. There were a bunch of different studies, but I can find one for you. And so that is in kittens, you'll recall. Best way to get that from me is to email me. Where's the chat? Here's the chat. Let me see if I can type. All right, jph@dogzombie.com. All right, so Natasha, I hope you can see my email there and that you can send me email and I will find that reference for you.
Fabulous, thank you. Penelope, she says she's curious about the connection of the ability to cope with stresses, both as a puppy and adult, based on knowledge of parents' abilities.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the question that if you look at how the parent copes with stress, then you can predict how the puppy will probably cope with stress? Is that the question?
That's the way I was interpreting it.
Yeah. So, right. So what I would say is, so let's look at it from the point of view of someone whose goal is to get a really resilient puppy. Oh, hang on one second, because we're having a thunderstorm. And my husband is putting on thunder shirts. And Chris, can you give Dash 4 fingers of Soleo? Are you comfortable doing that? Thank you. Okay, well, if you think it's not worth it, it's going to pass real quick, then we can just not do it. Sorry, guys, lots of dog care during this webinar. Yeah, so I would say that if I'm trying to get a resilient puppy, then one of the things to do is to look at the parents and see how the parents handle stress. See how they are when strangers come to the home, see how they are when they're taken out into the world. Think about the things you're going to want to do with your puppy. And find parents who are doing those things and then figure out exactly how they are doing those things. And yes, that is going to be a big part of how to predict what's going on with the puppy. Unfortunately, it's not going to be 100% of it. And we've all heard stories of people who found 2 lovely, lovely parents and the puppy turned out to have some issue or other in terms of anxiety. And this may have been just a chance of genetics. It may have been a chance of something bad happening that the breeder had no control over. Just stuff happens, and this stuff is all just super complicated and messy because it's biology. That's how life is. But you are absolutely correct that looking at how the parents look is a great way to do your best bet at figuring out how the puppies are going to be.
Super. Alyssa says, could canine microbiota have an effect on how much a puppy gets stressed during new experiences in the socialization period?
Great question. So we do know that so what she's talking about is the population, the different species of bacteria and fungi that are in your gut. There's been a lot of interesting research done recently on how that affects personality and behavior. And we do believe that has a strong effect on humans and laboratory rodents and dogs and other mammals, presumably. So those studies have all looked at adults. And so we are still in the phase of figuring out exactly what this all means. We're a little bit wandering around in the dark, even with adults. So then to extrapolate the next step of, well, is this something that's going on with puppies? I think probably. But do we know what to do about it? Do we know that giving a puppy probiotics like we would do for an adult is the right answer? We just don't know. No one's done those studies so far as I know. I'm not sure I don't think they've even done them in humans. I haven't looked. It's possible that they have started giving probiotics to human infants, but I don't know that that's the case. In humans, there's so much less concern when we have them as little babies about, oh my God, are they going to turn out anxious? It's less what we freak out about as humans than we do as dogs. So a big I don't know there. I think probably, but I think we just don't know how to manage that.
For sure, yeah. And Alyssa also says, can we use GABA for calming down stress reactions?
You're asking about gabapentin, I'm guessing. And so I will defer that to a veterinary behaviorist. It would be the right person to ask that of. I have my opinions, but I don't want to take money for answering that question because it's not what I do for my job, and so I'm not an expert at it.
Okay. Question from Natasha. Could there be scope for investigating the brains of naturally deceased dogs in relation to the physiology of socialization?
Yeah. I get this question almost every time. I'm sorry.
She's saying such as household pets versus feral packs, or case studies from individuals known to be particularly bold versus fearful.
Yeah, so I get this question almost every time I give this talk. I very much want to do those studies, and I think they're quite technically possible. I actually have 12 brains, frozen brains, waiting for me at a nearby veterinary school where we managed to get someone to extract them. Those are from adult dogs, but that's sort of the first step, is working with adult dogs and starting to show some things, and then we would work with adult dogs who were fearful versus adult dogs who were not fearful, and then we'd start getting naturally deceased puppies is hard. Obviously, you also, like, if they deceased puppies generally die of illness, and then that sort of complicates the question. But we would start the work with adult dogs. Honestly, right now that's stalled out due to funding. It is the next step in analyzing those brains is super expensive. And right now, my laboratory the laboratory where I work is having real trouble convincing the American federal government that it is worth funding studies of dogs in order to better understand people. So the bind that we're in is that all of the money for funding, the massive proportion of the money for funding, comes from the federal government, but they're not interested in funding studies about dogs just to help dogs. We make the case that I think is a very real case, that if we understand how dog brains work, it will help us understand how human brains work. But there has been a bit of a feeling. So we used to study mice a lot. Researchers are starting to realize that mice and rats are not the best models for humans. Somehow the federal government has now decided that this means that no animals are good models for humans, which is not really the step that we were hoping that they would take. Anyways, no money. Then when you go to dog-specific charities, they just don't have the depth of funds that's necessary for doing the genetics is so expensive, you guys. Just tens and tens of thousands of dollars to do the next step of the study. So the brains are sitting there. I know a lot of people are very, like, every time I give this talk, someone's like, I would give you my dog's brain when he dies. I know that I could get my hands on the brains, but getting the money to actually do the work with them is the holdup. I'm still sort of trying to figure that one out. But yes, that would be the way to do it.
Okay. We've had a few people asking about access to the list of papers and research that you mentioned, but you've already covered that with your email address.
Yes, anyone can send me mail. And if we want, I can pull together the list of papers and you can mail them out to everybody if that's easiest.
That would be super. Yeah, okay. That'd be lovely. Penelope says, are there any studies on in utero responses to stimuli by the mother and how they may affect the young?
Excuse me, I don't know of any studies specifically in dogs looking at in utero stimuli. I know that there are a lot of studies in laboratory rodents and some in humans looking at differences in how the baby develops as an adult based on things that happened while the baby was in the uterus. And so there's some interesting recent stuff, given that the people who were in uterus during the September 11th, 2001 attacks in New York City are now old enough. They're adults now. So we can start looking at how they turned out as adults with the presumption that their mothers had some pretty severe trauma. If we're looking at babies that were in uterus in New York City during the attacks, we can presume that their mothers had some pretty severe trauma that day. And then we can look and see at how they turned out. And we are starting to see that there are differences in their stress responses. And then there's a lot of studies looking at this in rats. So far as I know, none in dogs, but I generally, it is just the fate of being a dog researcher that there don't tend to be studies in dogs, but I generally tend to feel that if it's true in humans, rats, and mice, that it's going to be something that's pretty much going to be in most mammals. So I would presume it's the same in dogs.
Okay, that's really interesting to find out what results will be from the 9/11 babies. Yeah. Chrissy has asked, when does cortisol start to be produced?
Right. So that was the part that I was talking about. So it's always, I say always produced. I don't actually know when it actually starts being produced at all. The interesting point that I was talking about is that you see the stress response be a real measurable stress response at 5 weeks of age in German Shepherds, 6 weeks of age in Yorkshire Terriers, 7 weeks of age in Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, also 7 weeks of age in Labrador Retrievers, I happen to know, although that's unpublished. Before that, the body is making it, but it's not releasing it in large amounts. And I don't know at what stage the body starts making it, although, sorry, I'm just thinking this through now. But I do know actually that the trigger for the mother to give birth is that as the baby gets larger, the baby starts pressing up against the uterus, and the baby's cortisol response to that is what triggers the mother to give birth. So they're definitely doing it in utero. And I will say also we had this data set that we published at the lab where I work, published recently. It was only 5 dogs, but we had a couple of embryonic brains, and just from a couple of time points, not too many time points. And I took a look to see in the brains when you could see those docking stations for cortisol, so the glucocorticoid receptors. So if there's no glucocorticoid receptors in the brain, then it doesn't matter if there's cortisol, the brain doesn't have any way to see it, right? And I could see the time point, the earliest time point they weren't there, and the later time points they were there. God, you'd think I'd remember what week it was, right? That would have been really nice. But there's a stage at which those start being made in the brain. And if anyone super cares, send me a mail and I'll look it up. Again, it was just a couple brains though, so it could vary across different breeds, and I wouldn't know.
Fascinating. Yeah. Natasha was responding to a comment that Penelope had made in the chat, and she was saying there is research correlating to cortisol levels in pregnant bitches and cortisol levels in their puppies. And she was saying that Jessica may know of it, but she can try and find the link. She said she'd try and find the link if she'd like. So
that'd be cool.
Yeah. Let's go down the list and see. And also Penelope says that there is a great program called Puppy Culture, which includes activities which challenges the puppies at an early age in order to build the puppy's confidence.
Yes, that is a great one. I think that Avidog also includes the activities. I know Avidog focuses a lot more on the before birth, but I believe it also includes activities for after birth. Let me just say quickly too, as I just scrolled down through the chat and I see people are asking if there's a low density background noise and if it's all in there. And oh, you're saying it's all in your head. So we had established previously that there's someone on this call with a lightsaber and they're waving it around. So you guys are not crazy. But we haven't figured out who it is.
It's not me.
No, it's not me either, unfortunately.
So yeah, we have loads of questions for you.
I don't mind. I'll go as long as
somebody mentioned Avidog further up. Avidog's puppy raising program based on all of these studies that we're discussing. That was Gail picked up on that. Elisa says, is there scientific studies to show the effect of the puppy culture program?
You would have to ask the puppy culture folks. I have never seen those studies. No. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to comment on that because I haven't seen them.
Yeah, I think from my experience with socialization, I think it can be done badly, and you can sensitize animals if people are not doing it correctly. I've seen people walking into our puppy classes, literally dragging the dog through the door, and the puppy's got the brakes on, and they're just not paying attention to the dog and giving their dog time to get used to the environment and feel comfortable. So you can sensitize a puppy as well.
Yes, it's really important to, and that's why it's hard to study it, right? Because you can give someone this protocol, but people can apply the protocol well, or they can apply the protocol badly, right? And what might be good for one puppy might be very bad for another puppy. So it is really hard to study this stuff.
I always have an interesting anecdote about one of my dogs. He comes from, about 3 hours drive away from a breeder. There was 2 puppies, and she kept one of the puppies herself, 2 males, only two males in the litter. We happened to be talking years later, and both discovered that both of our male dogs from the same puppy litter, just the 2 dogs, are both petrified of flies.
Flies.
I'm convinced something happened in that stage before they left.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, because they're both the same. They'll run for the hills if a fly's in the house.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Penelope was saying there's good info on YouTube on the puppy raising programs.
There probably is good info on YouTube, and there's probably bad info on YouTube too, so just be careful.
True. Adrienne says, read the puppy culture. She doesn't know of specific studies that prove its efficacy, but the whole program itself is based on research, and there's tons of anecdotal evidence to show that it works. Personally, she can't stress enough how much it has made a difference in her litters. So that's super. It's doing it right, as you say, knowing how to do it well. And Alyssa also says how to measure how do you measure an individual puppy that stress reaction stays mild? How to measure with an individual puppy that stress reaction stays mild and not becomes overstressed, as every litter is different because of their genetics.
Right. So for a researcher to do it, you'd be able to measure that stress hormone cortisol, which is not the best way of doing it, but it's something. But obviously a breeder can't do that, or an owner who's socializing their puppy, and you just have to look at behavior. And that's why socialization is challenging. It's so easy to overface a puppy and to ask him to do too much. But I think the best thing to do is to just learn dog body language and pay close attention to your puppy, remembering that some puppies are going to be very good at communicating their anxieties, and some puppies are not going to be as good at communicating their anxieties. And just learn your puppy and learn dog body language and stay sensitive to it.
Yeah. We have another question from Helen. Many people in my country do not socialise their pups until 16 weeks old after vaccinations are completed. And most people don't buy from breeders. This is challenging socialisation. As a trainer, I find it hard to persuade people to socialise when the very days, no to exposing a pup. I'm not sure what she means in the outside world. Suggestions, socialising in our arms, contact with other dogs.
Yeah.
Carrying the dogs around.
Yeah. So the I don't know what country you're in. In the US, I tend to point people. This still may give you some good talking points. I tend to point people at avsab.org. So that's American, or possibly Association of Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior, AVSAB. And they have so it's a group of veterinarians who are particularly interested in behavior, and they have a statement on their website about the importance of socialization, and that will give you some good talking points. It's convenient when you're in the same country that the group is in, but I think even so, finding those talking points can be useful. And you could try to bring them up with the veterinary association in your country and see if they could be convinced to come out with a similar consensus statement. But the point that I would make is first of all, yes, there are things you can do, like bringing the puppy out in your arms, or in a little wagon, which is adorable. Only letting the puppy walk around in places where you don't expect there to have been a lot of other dogs. But the other point that I would make is that in a country or a part of a country where vaccinations are routine, so like where I live, everybody vaccinates their dogs, particularly for those really diseases that we're scared of in puppies, are parvovirus and distemper, and dogs around here are vaccinated for that. So that decreases the risk. There is still a risk, but then you have to balance the risk of contracting parvo or distemper compared to the risk of growing up anxious and possibly biting someone and either losing your home or losing your life because of that. And the fact of the matter is, at least in my country, the risk of losing your home or your life for behavior problems is much greater than the risk of contracting parvo or distemper. So that is what I say to people. But it is very, very difficult when you are a trainer and you are telling someone the opposite of what their veterinarian tells them. I get that. So that is why I also point people to this online consensus statement from AVSAB.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you all right to take a few more questions?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, we've got Jennifer. She's asked, what causes an increased or decreased startle response?
What causes an increased or decreased startle response? So I guess I would say that the startle response is coming from, so what I talked about in this lecture was that sort of second wave of the stress response, the slightly slower wave where it takes a few minutes for the cortisol to build up in your body. But what actually happens when you very first see something scary is that your brain processes it in the amygdala, and the amygdala sends out some information to the rest of your body saying, okay, I saw something really scary. So like imagine if you're afraid of snakes, that you're walking through the woods and you think you see a snake and you feel this sudden burst of adrenaline. That's immediate, right? It's not like cortisol that takes a couple minutes to gradually build up. It's very, very fast. So what's happening is that your amygdala is sending a signal directly through a nerve, not through hormones, but directly through a direct nerve connection down to your adrenals, which are little glands next to your kidneys. And they are releasing what we in the States call adrenaline, and I believe in the UK you like to call it epinephrine. And that is what makes you feel that sudden shock of like, snake, or, I just fell down, or roller coaster, or whatever. I can give you some hypotheses, and that is what would make you have the startle response. I can give you some hypotheses about why the startle response would be larger or smaller. Because it's a behavior, it's going to be complex, and there's going to be a lot of different reasons for it. So one reason could be that the amygdala has decided this is a particularly frightening thing, and it's sending a particularly strong signal, and that makes you startle more. Another possibility is that if you have been living with chronic stress for a long time, then, as I said, your adrenal glands are what actually release the adrenaline. If you've been living with chronic stress for a long time, your adrenal glands will build up more and more adrenaline because they're basically coming to the conclusion that life is really scary and I had better be ready with a whole lot of adrenaline to deal with it. And so I like to tell the story of when I was in veterinary school in the US, super, super stressful, right? We were under really nasty chronic stress for 4 years straight. And I was talking to one of my friends, and she was saying that she dropped a glass and it shattered, and she screamed, which is not how we would normally respond to dropping a glass and having it shatter. And my other friends and I just sort of nodded wisely, and we're like, yep, the stress of vet school will do that to you. So she had been under so much stress because of all the exams that her adrenals had just started building up more and more adrenaline. And when she dropped the glass, they released all this adrenaline, and her body overreacted with a super big startle response. So some of that, there's probably other stuff going on that I don't know about because it's the brain, and the brain is complicated, but that is a start for you.
Lynn says, nature versus nurture, is it 50-50 or is one more important than the other?
Yeah, we really want to put numbers on it, and I really resist putting numbers on it. So the way I think about it is that, and I give a whole nother talk on genetics and how all this stuff works, but the way I think about it is that genetics is it isn't like genetics programs you to be a certain way, and then your environment comes and sort of moves you a chunk in one direction or the other. It's more like genetics isn't programming, there will be this much fearfulness. Genetics is telling your brain as it develops, start going in the direction of fearfulness. And then there's going to be this really super complex set of interactions as the puppy develops, where the genetics is going to be, so if this is him becoming more fearful, I assume you guys can see me on the video, then genetics is pushing him this way, but environment might keep pushing him back down. And so if you had a bunch of clone puppies with the same genetics and you had them in slightly different environments, you'd see some pretty surprisingly large differences in behavior. But that doesn't mean that environment is much, much more important than genetics, because there's also this, like, genetics is really going to sort of keep pushing you in one direction. What it means is that these interactions are just so complicated. And so you can't really put numbers on it. And I know that sounds like weasel words, but I've been asked this question a lot, and I used to try to put numbers on it, and I thought about it, and I felt like I was doing people a disservice by putting numbers on it. It's both, it's complicated, and like you might have a puppy where they had this massive trauma when they were young, and so their environment was a huge part of how they turned out. Or it might be that you had a puppy who for some reason was super, super resilient because of their genetics, and so their genetics were a huge part of how they turned out. But that's just those two puppies, right? And it's might be a different way for other puppies. So I hope that is satisfying. I suspect that's not satisfying, but I hope it's satisfying.
Thank you. We'll just do 3 more questions, if that's okay. Otherwise, we'll have you here all night. We've got from Chrissy, and the question there is, are specific cut-off times for fear response phases? Are there specific cut-off times? Is 4 months a given?
Yeah, so what we have shown scientifically is that the fear response turns on, as I said, between 5 and 7 weeks for the various breeds that we've tested. And before that you don't see fear, and after that you do see fear. And scientifically, there hasn't been shown what a lot of people call fear periods, but a lot of breeders do perceive fear periods. And I do not want to say that they are wrong, because scientists have done a pretty crappy job, in my opinion, of really studying canine development. So I think that there probably are times during development, particularly early adolescence, when dogs may show more fear than they had been previously. And you hear this from people all the time. They have a puppy, the puppy was fine one day, the next day suddenly the puppy's fearful, then after a week it passes. That happens. It's super hard to study. The laboratory where I work really wants to study it, but because it happens unpredictably, it's hard to study. Like, it's a lot easier to study that 5 to 7 week change, because you know exactly when it's going to happen. And you know, following a 4 or 5 month old puppy, you know, following a litter of little puppies with their breeder isn't so hard, because you get in touch with the breeder, you know when the puppies are going to be there, you can set it all up, you can go once a week, all the puppies are in the same place. Following puppies when they're 4 or 8 months old, they're not all going to be in the same place, they're scattered. It's just really hard. So science doesn't know, science can't answer you. I think that is probably a thing, but no one has figured out how to map it yet, and I hope we do figure it out.
Okay. Teresa asks, do pheromones from the mother not also affect fear responses in puppies?
Oh, probably, yes. Gosh, I've never really thought that through. The real question is, do different mothers have different levels of pheromones, right? Because if they all have it exactly the same, then it doesn't really matter for our purposes. We do know, of course, I'm sure this is what you're talking about, but just for others' benefit, we do know that mother dogs' pheromones, what is it? So it's dog appeasing pheromone, DAP is the product. I want to say that they get it out of the milk, but I don't remember that for sure. And I'm sure someone on here knows and can correct me. And that will calm puppies. And so and adult dogs. And so we use this as a product where you can spray it up on a bandana and put the bandana around the dog's neck, and it will help calm an anxious dog down, right? And so then I think a really interesting question to study would be, do different moms secrete different amounts of this, and how does that affect the puppies once they're adults? And then the next question would be, can you breed for that, so that you're breeding moms who are going to produce really resilient puppies? That would be a fascinating question. I don't think anyone has looked at that. That's a great idea, though. Get me the money and I'll do it.
Especially as we know how our canine companions are so sensitive to smell and wonderful. And the last question, we've got so many great questions. Lindy says, do we have any information on epigenetics and the effects on this and on the inheritance of behavior from the sire?
Yeah. So epigenetics is a bit of a thing with me. So the story that the popular press likes to tell about epigenetics is that a dog as an adult can have some experiences that cause him to be, say, afraid of something. And he can then pass the fear of that particular thing down to his offspring. Not because his DNA has changed, but because these sort of markings on the DNA, which I like to think of, a good way of thinking of them is if the DNA is a massive encyclopedia about how to build a dog, epigenetics are bookmarks in the book that say this is an important place to go to, use this more to build this dog, right? And so that he can pass down these markers in his DNA, which would be in his sperm, and then the babies would grow up being born with these fears. And so then you would think, okay, so then if I have several generations of resilient dogs, even just through socialization, not through genetics, then that will sort of help later dogs be resilient. So the truth is that this ability for an adult to pass on experiences to the offspring has been demonstrated, but in a very, very limited way. We do see that the adult has experiences and there are markers over their DNA. That is what epigenetics means, markers on the DNA. What we also know for sure is that at the point that the egg and the sperm come together to create the new embryo, all of those markers are erased. So for the most part, those markers are not passed on. We have demonstrated that in some cases they do seem to get passed on. These cases seem to be really rare. They're not really well understood. And therefore, I don't really think that they are useful things to take into account, say, in a breeding program. What I will say, though, is that from the moment that a puppy is conceived, he is starting to make changes to his DNA. And so the father may not have a whole lot of ability to pass on. He does have a little bit of ability to pass on through microRNAs, which we could talk about if we had time for more questions than we don't. Father has a little bit of ability to pass a tiny little bit of information on, but the mom has a lot of ability to pass information on while the puppy's in the uterus. And that is epigenetics. So when we talked about what was going on with these babies who are in the uterus during the 9/11 attacks, what is happening to those babies is that as mom goes through a trauma, her cortisol is rising, that's passing through the placenta and going in through the bloodstream and affecting the baby. And the baby is, as he develops, his body is saying, oh, lots of cortisol, it's going to be a scary world out there. I better save that information so that as I develop, I know that there's going to be lots of trauma out there waiting for me. And the way the baby saves that information is through epigenetic changes in the DNA. And when I kept talking about the off switch and how the hippocampus has this hyperactive off switch because it has more or fewer receptors, that's all mediated by epigenetics as well. So early in life, so in the uterus, in early socialization, during maternal care, epigenetics is changing how many of those receptors are made and how that off switch works. So epigenetics is super, super important, super, super interesting, super something that we should study. However, not so much something that is passed on from the dad or from the mom before she gets pregnant, more something that's passed on after she gets pregnant, if that makes sense. Sorry, a bit of a pet peeve of mine, so you got a rant.
Yeah, brilliant. The questions that we haven't got round to, I've been asked, do you have a forum where they could be posted?
Yeah, sure. I have a Facebook page, so why don't we do it there? Actually, let me just go. So if you go to Facebook and you search for Dog Zombie Blog, but let me just, or Dog Zombie by Jessica Hekman, but it is facebook.com/dogzombieblog. We'll type your comment. There it is. So you want to go there. Don't go to my regular page. Go to that page. It's not showing up. Why is it not showing up?
There's a Facebook address at the top just appeared.
Oh, did it go away at the top?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, I was looking at the bottom.
Okay.
Okay, good. So you have it. Perfect.
Lovely. That's
you go there. I will go there right now, and I will make a post saying I just did this talk that was so much fun, and I heard some people might have questions, and then you guys can just put all your questions in that post.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for delivering such a wonderful webinar for this evening. We've really, really enjoyed it. The comments from people in the chat are all echoing what I'm saying. They really enjoyed themselves, and
great.
It's really good. And thank you for all our attendees for joining us this evening as well. Before we leave, if I could just make everyone aware of our next webinar, and that's going to be on Sunday the 20th of September at 7 p.m. And our presenter will be Vivek Francis. The title for this webinar is Reiki Healing, What It Is and How It Can Help. Details for this and other ICB webinars can be found on the International Canine Behaviourists website or on the ICB Facebook page. The recording for this evening's webinar will be sent out within the next 7 days, and it will be mailed to the email address to your PayPal account. So once again, thank you so much, Jessica. We've thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. And thanks for attending, everyone, this evening too. So I shall say good night now.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Good night.